All right, you know what? They said it was going to be better. Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey 2 is a follow-up to last year's maligned public domain slasher film that took the classic story of Winnie the Pooh and his woodland buddies and turned them into feral beasts, allowing themselves some room to rebuild the cracked foundations of the first film by making that an in-universe movie in the sequel that was based off of the 100 Acre Massacre. Blood and Honey 2 is being positioned as the movie that Reese Frake Waterfield and Scott Chambers wanted to make with the first one. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. I was pretty brutal on the first Blood and Honey when I made that video a few weeks back, but I mentioned at the end that I was curiously looking forward to the sequel because the trailer looked to show a huge improvement, and there's no possible way they could make it worse than the first movie, so I was willing to give it a go. I can tell you right away that yes, Blood and Honey 2 is a huge, huge improvement over the first one. That movie felt like a rushed, cynical cash grab, while the sequel feels so much more inspired. It's got a lot more personality and character, and while some of what they were able to accomplish is absolutely because of the higher budget they were working with, thanks to the eye-watering return the first one made, where the improvements really come are just in this movie having more of an identity than the first. The most obvious step up is the completely overhauled designs for Pooh and his buddies, and this is such a welcome change that made a lot more difference than you might think. Gone are the expressionless, bland killers from the first movie, replaced now by some genuinely cool prosthetics, and probably more importantly, they actually talk in this one. I could never shake the feeling of watching silent masked killers in the first movie, despite what they tried to tell me they were, but in Blood and Honey 2, they are unmistakably monsters. I think the thing that surprised me the most, though, was the amount of story and characterization present in the sequel. Let's bear in mind that we're coming into this from the perspective of the first one, so the bar is incredibly low, but Matt Leslie's script is a massive step up. I think that retconning the portrayal of the 100 Acre Massacre from the first movie was the best play for them because that allowed so much more room to breathe when coming up with how they wanted to handle Christopher Robin and the monsters he has to face. The script isn't perfect by any means. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but let me praise this movie. It feels good. They've earned it. Compared to what we got last year, this is solid. There are some things I genuinely really enjoyed about this movie, particularly early on when we get treated to some really nice eerie imagery in the forest that shows how much Reese understands that kind of look. You could see brief glimpses of him doing a lot to lean into a visual style in the first movie, but there is so much more here in the way of giving the frame an appealing aesthetic with rolling fog and a bright full moon. It looks like a Halloween picture book at times, and I mean that in the best way possible. You know what, actually? It often looks like what I'd imagine it would if Winnie the Pooh had a horror-themed entry back in the day. Eerie imagery goes a very long way for me, and some of the shots put a grin on my face because I could just tell that Reese just understands how to evoke that sort of horror fairy tale imagery. Then we've got the designs of Pooh and friends, which aren't just a step up from the first, they're pretty damn awesome. The amount of detail in each of them was such a treat, and this time Owl and Tigger are joining in on the fun, and my god are they ever a welcome addition. Owl's definitely my favorite out of the bunch. He's like the old wise one. He got some of my favorite shots in the whole movie, flying through a moonlit sky over the forest, and Tigger is also a huge highlight. He's this sort of like Freddy Krueger-esque quip machine. This is such a far cry from the first because I was actually having fun in basically every scene when the killers were present, since they have so much more personality to them this time around. There is also a noticeable bump in the brutality on display, and thank the heavens they actually incorporated the characteristics of the villains into their kills, which is one of the biggest issues I had with the first one, since there was nothing beyond their masks that made them feel like the characters they're based off of. There weren't any like extremely memorable kills in this movie, but there's a lot more to them, and it felt like they made more sense coming from their respective characters. Tigger is particularly vicious and would probably be the one I'd want to bump into the least out of the bunch. It's pretty gory, and some of the practical effects are well done. You know, this is still a smaller budget movie. It's still an independent movie, so, you know, we're not getting like the craziest practical effects in the game, but there is some really solid stuff here. There is some CGI as well. It's not very invasive, and it actually kind of works oddly for the story. In terms of story, we're also looking at a massive improvement from what we had the first time around. There are actual characters in this movie that have arcs. that progress as the events of the story unfold. We learn some things about the backstory of these beasts, we get some more emotional moments because there's so much more care into making you actually give a shit. Now, is any of this stuff amazing? No. It's just way better than last time, and actually gave something to latch onto as a source of engagement where the first gave nothing. It's not incredible, but it's very serviceable. Of course, the movie is not without its issues. There are a few things in particular that didn't really land all that well, particularly the pacing and the extremely heavy-handed way that the backstory is delivered. There's nothing nearly as egregious as that pool chase scene in the first, but it still did feel like some scenes would just drag on a little longer than they needed to, or move slower than it felt like they should have. You definitely start to feel like, okay, I've been away from the killers for long enough now. I get it, we do have to do a story, but like, it's called Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. I kind of want to be spending time with these killers, especially because I really enjoy the villains every time they're on screen. You do sometimes like just want to get back to them. There's definitely some muckiness there in the flow of the movie that would cause it to drag sometimes, but it never lasted too long and was usually followed up by something more significant that moved things forward. I think my biggest issue with this sequel is the reliance on very heavy exposition to fill us in on the backstory of Pooh and his buds. This is particularly an issue in the second act, where we're getting a ton of background into Christopher as well as the villains, but it's basically all given to us in one, painfully long exposition dump from a character we just met. It sort of feels like they wanted to have covered more narrative ground in the first movie, but didn't want to spend much time catching up in the sequel, so they set aside like 2 scenes to just shove a ton of information down our throats in a really forced way that isn't at all conducive to allowing the audience to actually care about it. It's a shame because I actually think some of the backstory was really cool and felt like it fit well, but the way it was delivered was a slog. It also kind of feels like they knew that it was a bit of a sluggish scene, because they directly followed up with a really great action sequence. The second act was definitely the weakest part of the film. It's where the movie kind of drags its feet for a long time and just dumps exposition on you constantly, but the first act had a lot of fun, creepy imagery and some really entertaining kill scenes with the villains, and the third act was actually sort of awesome. We wind up in a setting that I'm not really sure how I feel about for a Winnie the Pooh movie, but it was still a really entertaining scene that let Tigger in particular show off what he's got. It's a good time. I think the only issue that I have with like the kill scenes with these villains is that sometimes they do too much of like silhouette kills where it's like, oh, you're seeing the shadow of this happening, or oh, you're seeing it through like a plastic sheet. So you don't really get the full effect of it. I get it, they don't have infinite money to work with, but it happens a few too many times. There's also like a lot of decapitation, like a lot of decapitations. And then there is still this tonal uncertainty that seems to have carried over from the first, where we'll have like a super emotional scene where a character is getting deep into a traumatic history and trying to work through a really difficult childhood memory, and then we'll cut to Winnie the Pooh murdering people. The vibe's a little all over the place and doesn't feel all that smooth, which I think is a symptom of the sequel maybe still trying to take itself too seriously for the concept. The tone just has these really awkward swings that made it hard to get fully invested in the movie, because it sometimes feels like you're hot swapping between 2 different stories. But because I actually didn't mind the character story and had a lot of fun when it would switch to the killers, this wasn't something that ruined the experience. Also, by the way, it's not just the kill scenes with these villains that's entertaining. I could just watch them interact for a while. They are so entertaining when they're just sitting in their lair, which is such a cool looking location, by the way. It's a great set, but they also light it so well. Just watching Pooh and his friends interact was so much fun. I want to really emphasize this point here, by the way. There are a few things that were a nice surprise in the sequel. The visual style was much better realized, the narrative actually exists and plays a part in the events of the movie, and your investment in the characters and the villains were genuinely a lot of fun. But the thing that was the biggest shock for me was Scott Chambers as the lead role of Christopher Robin, because this dude is an absolutely incredibly he's an incredible actor, and I fully mean that. You don't go into a movie like this expecting to see anywhere near the amount of emotion that dude is capable of portraying when the script calls for it. There are some scenes that actually pulled the heartstrings a little bit, because both the script created more sympathetic characters that I cared a little bit more about, but also, it was mainly because Scott carries these moments with a ton of weight. His physical reaction to one scene in particular was full-on shocking and actually kind of got to me, where he's not just using his face and voice to portray a feeling, he's letting it pour out of his whole body, and I was not expecting anything like that here. He's great, and I absolutely want to see more of his projects because I can only imagine what this dude is capable of if he was able to deliver this kind of performance in a Winnie the Pooh slasher movie. I do think that the movie's ending falls a little flat. Not nearly as bad as the first one, but there are some things that happened that feel like they really should have been acknowledged, at least in the facial expressions of the characters that didn't even seem like they were thinking about this huge event in their lives. It's hard to talk about without spoiling the ending, but this is one of the biggest culprits of that tonal conflict I was talking about. It's a very abrupt ending, and the song choice is strange. We're definitely getting more of these movies. I mean, obviously we know about all the individual public domain horror movies they're working on and the ensemble Poohniverse that's coming next year. The world is backwards, ladies and gentlemen, but we're definitely getting a Blood and Honey 3. If they can keep on the trajectory they're on now, that could actually be a damn good time, as long as they clean up the pacing and manner in which the story is delivered. Look, they promised that this was going to be better, and it is. If anyone tells you this isn't a massive improvement over the first movie, then they're full of shit and just like hating on things. You don't have to love the movie. I wouldn't say that I did, but it's an objective improvement over what they gave last year. It is still far from perfect, but I had a decently fun time with it. I said in the intro to my review for the first one that all I really wanted was a dumb slasher movie with some character and some personality, and while I do think that this one, taking itself a tad too seriously, does leave a bit to be desired there, I can genuinely say that I enjoyed my time with Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey 2. Not sure I expected to say that. I loved the visual tone, especially early on. The creature designs are awesome and they have so much more character to them. The story has a lot more going on with some fun backstory, and Scott Chambers absolutely kills it in the lead role. Hell, I also like the score more this time around. It felt like a dark fairy tale, which is spot on the kind of vibe this should have. Composer Andrew Scott Bell did a good job at helping to build the tone of the movie, and overall, you can just tell that everyone involved with this sequel was given more of a chance to bring their vision to life because they had more time and resources to make it happen. The first movie put me in a really bad mood, but that didn't happen here. I enjoyed myself, I had fun, and I'm now looking forward to what else is to come from this really goofy cinematic horror universe. Stick with the dark fantasy tone, and I think they could have an entertaining, schlocky franchise on the horizon. Nothing amazing, nothing all that great, but some nice, fun, silly horror candy that basically delivers exactly what it promised. Alright, well, I'm pleased and a little surprised and also relieved because I really didn't want to sit through something like the first one again. Coming up on Friday, I've got the final review in the Omen franchise before the prequel drops next week, but until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.